I'm going to do a little bit of a PowerPoint here today. And in my last two Bible studies on the calendar, I covered two major pieces of the puzzle, if you will. I showed that John 7, verse 37, is referring to the seventh and last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and not to the eighth day sacred assembly, as we used to believe, as most churches of God still believe. That's where the name, of course, we got the term last great day from that scripture. We no longer use that because we realize that John 7:37 is actually referring to the eighth day and not the seventh and last day of the Feast of, it's just referring to the seventh and last day of the Feast of Tabernacles and not the eighth day. Number two, last time I showed that the events mentioned from John 10, about verse 2, all the way on through John 10:21, were all events. Those 2.5 chapters there were all events that actually took place on the eighth day, that then are events that actually add meaning to the eighth day. And it can be further proven and demonstrated that John 7:37 cannot be referring to the eighth day as we once thought, and as many still believe. And the proof of that is in John 9:14, as we'll see it a little bit later here in this Bible study. So today in part 9 of this series, I want to give two more pieces of the puzzle, then put all four of those pieces together to demonstrate that how the book of John, because the book of John is the key, how the book of John actually ties in with the calendar, with calendar issues in a very interesting and substantive way, and how it actually supports the present-day Hebrew calendar that we use, even incorporating postponement rules, which many would say should not be in there because they were added much later. But those are views and difficulties I'll address later in another Bible study. So the title, as it shows here on the slide, is the Calendar Part 9, Putting the Pieces Together. And now I want to begin by reviewing what we have learned from the first two pieces of the puzzle, as shown in the book of John. And that's specific. A few scriptures I'm going to show up here on the screen so all you can see it and read it, and some I'll be using the Bible, just reading from the Bible. But in this case, I want to point this out. John 7, verse 2 says, "Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand." And then verse 37 says, "On the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, 'If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink.'" Now, how many days? This is the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. How many days was the Feast of Tabernacles observed? Well, we go to Leviticus, and it tells us very plainly. And there's other scriptures I could add to this. Leviticus 23, verse 34 says, "Speaking to the children of Israel, speak to the children of Israel, I should say, saying, that the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord." And then verse 39 says, "You shall keep the feast of the Lord for 7 days." It emphasizes 7 days, not 8 days, 7 days. And then verse 41, "You shall keep it as a feast of the Lord for 7 days." And in verse 42, it even says, "You shall dwell in booths for 7 days." So the instructions given to us in Leviticus said they only really had to dwell in booths for 7 days. What then would the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles be? Well, it would be the 7th day, like John 7:37 indicates. Thus, John 7:37 is referring to the 7th and last day of the Feast of Tabernacles and not to the 8th day sacred assembly. That's the first piece of the puzzle when you're trying to put calendar issues together with what we have in the book of John. Now, what does it say in Leviticus 23 in regards to the 8th day? Well, verse 36 of Leviticus 23, it says, "On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation. It is a sacred assembly, and you should do no customary work on it." Again, going back to John 7:37, I'll just read it here. "On that last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and said, 'If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink.'" But obviously, this is all it says about the 8th day. Now, what happened as the 7th and last day of the Feast of Tabernacles came to an end? What did they do? What happened? John 7, verse 53. It says everyone went to his own house. Well, they all went home, or they came down from their booths. A lot of times they had the booths on top of the house, but they could go back into their own house because, as we read in Leviticus 23, they only actually had to dwell in booths for 7 days. It doesn't say they had to dwell in a booth on the 8th day. So, and here at the end of the 7th day, it says they went back to their house because, again, they didn't have to dwell in booths on the 8th day according to the instructions of Leviticus 23. What happened the next morning, on the morning of the 8th day sacred assembly, the day following John 7:37? What happened the next day? Now, early in the morning, on this very next day, John 8, verse 2, he, Christ, came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. So it's interesting. It's not only Christ, it's Christ and all the people, they came back to the temple. Well, why did they come back to the temple the next day? Well, because it was a holy day. It was the 8th day sacred assembly. And so Christ then, as they met on that day, he sat down and taught them. Because it was now the 8th day sacred assembly, it was a holy day. Now this teaching here, beginning here in John 8:2, continues all the way down through John 10:21. I'm not going to go through that again. I covered that in the previous Bible study. Where they are still debating over this blind man. They were in the temple, and remember when he comes out of the temple later that morning, or around noon maybe, he runs into a man who'd been blind from birth. Chapter 9, I think it is, verse 1. And he healed the man who'd been blind from birth. And then these Pharisees, they're arguing over this blind man who'd been blind from birth, and the healing of that, and debating on that. And that teaching then about what's going on here, this blind man, continues all the way down through chapter 10, verse 21. I don't have a slide on this, but I'll just read it. John 10:21, where it just ends the events that are covered there on the 8th day. But it says, others said, and they're arguing about this, these are not the words of one who has a demon. Because some say, well, Christ did this through a demon, healing this man who's blind from birth. But others said, these are not the words of one who has a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? So all the way down through chapter 10, verse 21, they're still arguing about this man who'd been healed on the 8th day. So all those events from John 8:2 down through John 10:21 are events that took place on the 8th day. So that then is the second piece of the puzzle, that all the events mentioned from John 8, verse 2, all the way down through and including John chapter 10, verse 21, occurred on the 8th day. That is a review of the first two pieces of the puzzle. But now let's take a look at the third piece of the puzzle by asking this question. Was the Feast of Tabernacles and the 8th day sacred assembly, what Feast of Tabernacles and 8th day sacred assembly mentioned here in John 7:37 and going on through John 8:9 and the first part of chapter 10, what Feast of Tabernacles and 8th day sacred assembly was this? Well, we don't have to guess. The book of John tells us which Feast of Tabernacles it was, that's generally speaking. It was the Feast of Tabernacles that occurred in the year before Christ died. If you follow the events in John from this point on, John 10, up to the time Christ died and that Passover, it shows clearly that this Feast of Tabernacles mentioned in John 7:37 was the Feast of Tabernacles that occurred in the year before Christ died. Now I want to blank this out just for a second here. What happened next after the conclusion of this particular 8th day sacred assembly here mentioned in John chapters 8, 9, and 10? I'm going to continue picking it up here in John 10. We just read John 10:21, where they were still arguing about this blind man. Then it tells what happened next. John 10, verse 22, if you just follow along in your Bibles. Now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. So this is the following winter, after the fall feast. And Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. So this Feast of Dedication was also called, of course, as you know, the Festival of Lights, or it's called today by the Jews, it's called Hanukkah, and still celebrated by Jews today. They celebrate on the 25th of Kislev, which is the 9th month of the Jews' ecclesiastical year, corresponding to our December. So it usually takes place sometime in our December today. So they were there at this Feast of Dedication. What did the Jews want to know from Jesus at this particular Feast of Dedication? Well, if you're in your Bibles, read verse 24 of John chapter 10. John 10:24. They were there at this Feast of Dedication this following winter. Then the Jews surrounded him. They surrounded Christ and said to him, "How long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." They wanted to know if he was the promised Messiah. They didn't like his answer, if you go through and read the rest of this. So they first took up stones again to stone him, as it says in chapter 10, verse 31. And then they sought again to seize him, but he escaped out of their hand. John 10, verse 39, if you follow down. What happened next? I'll just read it here. John 10, verse 40. And then after that, after he escaped out of their hand, in verse 39, he went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was baptizing at first, and there he stayed. While Christ was there beyond the Jordan, that winter, early spring, Lazarus became sick and died. If you go through and read the next scriptures there, John 11. Of course, then Christ raised him from the dead. And Christ then eventually came to the home of Mary and Martha in Bethany. Again, and he resurrected Lazarus back to life. As you go on, all this is recorded in John 11:1 through John 11, verse 45. And I'll just pick it up here in John 11, verse 45. Because this is at the end of where Lazarus had been resurrected from the dead. That following, winter, or early spring. Verse 45 of John 11. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did, like raising Lazarus from the dead after he'd been dead for 3 days, they believed in him. Said, wow. But some of them, verse 46, went away to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus did. Now, to some of the Pharisees and the scribes and chief priests, the resurrection of Lazarus was the last straw because they were afraid of losing power. They were afraid now this Jesus is going to have much of a following. And they now sought then to put Jesus to death. As we go on here, the next slide, John 11, verse 53. We're picking this up right after Lazarus has been raised from the dead. John 11, 53 and 54. Then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. He was going to have too much of a following. Some people really were going to believe he was a Messiah. Therefore, Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. This is now nearing what time of the year? John 11, very next verse, John 11:55. And the Passover of the Jews was near. And many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. So this now is the Passover following the Feast of Tabernacles of John 7:37. This is the next next Passover. It was now the time of the Passover. And I'll just read the next verse. Go to John 12, verse 1. I'll leave it there. John 12, verse 1. Then 6 days before that Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he'd raised from the dead. Was this Passover now that's beginning to be talked about here in John 12, was this the Passover on which Christ would die? John 12, verses 23 and 24. But Jesus answered them, saying, the hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. Now the remainder now of the book of John, from this point on, it covers events surrounding the Passover on which Christ died. This then gives us a third piece of the puzzle of what we have in the book of John. The Feast of Tabernacles of John 7 was a Feast of Tabernacles that occurred in the year prior to the Passover on which Christ died. Now, why would that be significant as far as the calendar and calendar issues are concerned? It becomes significant because of the next piece of the puzzle. This is a very significant piece of the puzzle when you understand all this and you put it together. This fourth piece of the puzzle is the key piece that ties all these other pieces together and gives us a complete picture. And the fourth piece of the puzzle is given to us in one particular verse. Very interesting verse. The fourth piece of the puzzle, John 9, verse 14. John 9. Now we know the events of John 9 are occurred on the 8th day. The 8th day sacred assembly. And it says, and you might say, well, yeah, of course it was a Sabbath because it's a holy day. But it says in John 9:14, now it was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. This man had been blind from birth. When Christ walked out of the temple on that day, he met the man blind from birth and he healed him. But then he rubbed clay on his eyes and so on. He says it was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay. So we also know that this Sabbath, when Jesus opened the eyes of the man who had been blind from birth, was also the 8th day sacred assembly. It was also an annual holy day Sabbath. And I have to ask a question. Is that why John 9:14 says it was a Sabbath? We can figure out for ourselves that it was an annual holy day Sabbath. You know, God, it's very interesting that God doesn't always give us all the details of everything. If there's things that we can figure out for ourselves by actually taking our minds into God's Word and meditating on it and thinking about it, we can figure a lot of things out for ourselves. And you can actually figure out that this it took place on the 8th day sacred assembly, if you think about it and study it. So we don't have to be told that. But if this holy day Sabbath, this 8th day sacred assembly that we put in John 8, 9, and 10, if that also fell on a weekly Sabbath, as it can do, as we know from time to time, then we would have to be told that. We could not figure that out. We'd have to be told that it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And I believe that is precisely what John 9:14 is telling us, that this 8th day sacred assembly on which the blind man had been healed was also a weekly Sabbath. And the book of John itself tends to support that conclusion. And I'm going to blank it out just for a second. How does the book of John support that conclusion? By what's recorded in John 19, verse 31. Turn to John 19. Turn to John 19. I'll begin in verse 30. John 19, verse 30 says, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished, and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. We know this is a Passover now on which Christ died. The afternoon of that Passover day, he finally died, about 3 in the afternoon. Other scriptures tell us that. So he died on the Passover. Now verse 31. Therefore, because it was the preparation day, okay, now key question. Preparation day for what? Preparation day for the weekly Sabbath, or the first preparation day for the first day of unleavened bread, which was a high day, or an annual holy day Sabbath. Well, going on in verse 31, therefore, because it was the preparation day, the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath, that particular Sabbath, was a high day. So this day was a high day. Now, here's the thing. Jamieson Fausset Brown commentary actually, by the way, has that right, because it actually says that it was the first day of unleavened bread. JFB actually says that in its commentary on this particular verse, John 19:31. Well, I have to ask the question, why does it tell us this day was a high day Sabbath? We know Christ died on the Passover, and we know that in the year Christ died, the Passover fell on a Wednesday. I'm not going to go through and show that. We should all have known that. We've got booklets to cover that. It occurred on a Wednesday in the middle of the week, just as prophesied in Daniel 9:27, where it says, in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Thus, this first day of unleavened bread, this annual high day Sabbath, had to fall on a Thursday in this particular week. It had to fall on a Thursday, didn't it? Christ died on a Wednesday, then the first day of unleavened bread, that high day Sabbath had to fall on a Thursday. When a Sabbath falls during a day of the week, it is then designated as being a high day Sabbath, as that is the only Sabbath that will occur on the day of the week. You wouldn't know it was a Sabbath if it occurs on the day of the week unless you say it's a high day Sabbath. On the other hand, if an annual high day Sabbath occurs on a weekly Sabbath, then to know that, we must be told that it was a Sabbath, meaning it was also a weekly Sabbath, which is precisely what John 9:14 is telling us in regards to this particular Sabbath. It was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. So as this is telling us, in my opinion, by putting it all together, it seems very clear that it's telling us here that this 8th day sacred assembly fell on a weekly Sabbath, which occurred in the year prior to the Passover in which Christ died. And we know that the Passover in which Christ died had to occur on a Wednesday in the middle of the week. So that then is our fourth key piece of the puzzle. Let's see. Okay. But before reviewing those pieces, I wanted to add two additional pieces of the puzzle here. These two pieces give us clues as to the possible years in which the Feast of Tabernacles in John 7 occurred, and the years that the Passover in which Christ died could have occurred. Now, the first of these two additional pieces of the puzzle is given to us in Matthew 2, verses 1 to 2 here. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king. So Herod the king was still living when Jesus was born. Behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who was born King of the Jews? So this tells us that Jesus was born in the days of Herod the Great, when he was the king of the Jews. Now, let's look, I'll just leave that slide up there, but let's go and turn to Matthew chapter 2. And I'll just read a few verses here. Matthew 2, verse 16, talking about the time of Herod the Great. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, he was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which had been determined from the wise men. Now, just prior to this, of course, an angel had warned Joseph and Mary to flee to Egypt with their young child, and they were there until the death of Herod. It tells us that in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Now, let's go down to chapter 2 of Matthew, and I'll just read this. Verse 19. Now, when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, and saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. So Christ would have been under 2 years of age when Herod died. Now, most historical records, if you go back and try to find out, what year did Herod the Great die? Most historical records indicate that Herod the Great died in the spring of 4 B.C. One source, Halley's Bible Handbook, gives 3 B.C. as the year Herod died. I've been watching some great course. We ordered a great course a while back on great figures of the New Testament. We've only watched about the first 3 of those 24 courses. It's given by Professor Amy Jill Levine. She covers it in about the second course. She covers a little bit about Herod the Great and says that most sources will say that Herod died in the 4 B.C., but there are other sources that will give you other dates. She says so it's not real 100% clear as to exactly when Herod the Great died, but he probably died in 4 B.C., but he could have died in 3 B.C. or 2 B.C. or something like that. She said we can't pin it down for sure, but most likely it was 4 B.C. But anyway, he died in either probably 3 or 4 B.C., which means what? It means Christ was born probably in the fall, and that, as we understand it, and that Christ was born in the fall of either 4 B.C. If Herod died in 3 B.C. and Christ was born before that, he might have been born as late as 4 B.C. or 5 B.C., maybe in the spring of 5 B.C. Most probably in the fall of 5 B.C. or about 6 months before Herod died in the spring of 4 B.C. But again, there's about a year variance you could have here because they can't really pin it down with absolute certainty. So that is one additional piece of the puzzle, that Christ was probably born in the fall of either 4 or 5 B.C. The second additional piece of the puzzle is given to us in Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3 at verse 23, which tells us this. Now, Jesus himself began his ministry. You know, his ministry lasted for about 3.5 years. Jesus himself began his ministry at about 30 years of age. Now, that's not a precise statement. It says he was about 30 years of age. Does that mean he was 29, about to turn 30? Does it mean he was 30, about to turn 31? You don't know. He was about 30. And did Herod die in 3 B.C. or 4 B.C.? Well, we don't know with absolute certainty. You can't be absolute certain on that. So all this gives us about 1 year's leeway one way or the other. I'm just going to blank this out for a second. But it does indicate this without taking the time to chart it all out. It indicates that the 2 most likely years on which Christ died, if you put it all together and try to figure it out, the 2 most likely years on which Christ died were either 30 A.D. or 31 A.D. And we know Christ died on a Wednesday. And if you use the Hebrew calendar, the Passover can fall on a Wednesday in both of those years. There's some years it can't. And not even with observation, it can't. But in the years 30 and 31, using the Hebrew calendar, the Passover can fall on a Wednesday in both of those years. Now, the Hebrew calendar is calculated. I'm going to get into that in the next Bible study. But it's calculated in one of 2 ways. It's calculated with postponement rules. They have 4 postponement rules, which I'll go into in next Bible study. But there's 4 postponement rules, and they can be calculated using postponement rules or not using postponement rules. And, of course, it can come out a little differently depending on whether you use postponement rules or not. And, of course, the calendar that we use today incorporates postponement rules, as is the calendar that the Orthodox Jews use today. It's the same calendar we use with one small variation, and that's counting to Pentecost, which I'll get into in the last Bible study on the calendar. But the bottom line is that when it comes to postponement rules and observing the Feast of Tabernacles, when you use postponement rules, you probably realize, if you think back on it, whenever you go to observe the Feast of Tabernacles, you're always going, it's either from Saturday to Saturday, it's from Monday to Monday, Tuesday to Tuesday, or Thursday to Thursday. If you use postponement rules, it's always going to, the Feast of Tabernacles on the 8th day is always going to go from one of those days of the week. It will never occur from Sunday to Sunday. It will never occur from Wednesday to Wednesday. It'll never occur from Friday to Friday. Because if you calculate it comes out on those days, if you calculate it with postponement rules, it will be postponed by 1 or 2 days. So if you use postponement rules, it can never occur, 8th day can never occur on a Sunday, on a Wednesday, or a Friday. So the main point I want to make today is that in 30 AD, it's interesting, if you go back and calculate the Passover for 30 AD, and you can calculate it mathematically for any given year in the past. You can not only calculate it, you can actually check your calculation very simply to see if you calculated it right and made a mistake or not. So you can pretty well nail it down. For any given year, you can find out when the feasts and holy days fell using the Hebrew calendar through calculation, mathematical calculation. The thing is, in 30 AD, whether you use postponement rules or not, the Passover will fall on a Wednesday. In 31 AD, the Passover only falls on a Wednesday if you use the Hebrew calendar with postponement rules. This is an interesting fact, mathematical fact. Now, there are some who say that postponement rules were not added to the Hebrew calendar until long after the time that Christ died. They could not have been in effect during the time of Christ. We'll look at that evidence in a later Bible study. But if that indeed is the case, if postponement rules were not used until long after Christ died, then they could not have been using that calendar at the time of Christ. And then Christ, what it means is Christ would have had to die in 30 AD, not in 31. Because again, Passover only falls on a Wednesday in 31 if you use postponement rules. It is very likely the Jews at the time of Christ were using some form of the Hebrew calendar. I'll get to that in a later Bible story. There is actually a lot of evidence of that. But before putting the pieces together, let's first look at what we have so far. What we have so far. 6 points. Number 1, Christ was born just prior to the death of King Herod the Great. 2, Christ was about 30 years of age when he began his ministry, which means he died on the Passover of either 30 or 31 AD. Number 3, John 7:37 is referring to the 7th and last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, not to the 8th day sacred assembly. Point 4, John 8, verse 2 through John 10:21 are referring to events which all took place on the 8th day. 5th piece of the puzzle, what we have. The Feast of Tabernacles of John 7 was the Feast of Tabernacles that occurred in the year prior to the year that Christ died. And the 6th point, the Feast of Tabernacles on the 8th day of John 7, chapter 7 through 10, was observed from Saturday to Saturday, as indicated in John 9:14, as that particular 8th day was a Sabbath, it says. That's the indications we have in the book of John. Again, point 6 there, meaning it was all Holy Weekly Sabbath in addition to being an annual Holy Day Sabbath. So those then are all the pieces of the puzzle. Now let's see what we can learn in regards to the calendar and calendar issues when we put all these pieces together. I'm going to blank this out just for a moment. What we have so far, what does that tell us in regards to the calendar and calendar issues? That's the question that came to my mind. What do we need to look for that would correspond to what we are told in the book of John? If you're going to look at a calendar, different versions of the calendar, where you can figure them out. You can calculate the Hebrew calendar, and as far as the new moons, they can actually kind of figure out when the new moons occurred as well, going back to any given year from records that they have. So what do we need to look for that would correspond to what we are told in the book of John? We need to look for a calendar that would give us a Wednesday Passover around 30 or 31 AD, and that would then be preceded by a Saturday to Saturday Feast of Tabernacles using that same calendar. Before doing that, however, I do want to do one additional thing here. I want to prove that John 7:37 has to be the seventh day of the Feast of Tabernacles and that it cannot be the eighth day. I think this is very interesting because the majority of the churches of God today still believe John 7:37 refers to the eighth day, which they call the last great day. I can prove to you that cannot be the case. And the proof is right here in the book of John. If you think about it. You can prove that by this question. I was, a number of years ago, I was thinking about this, and I woke up in the middle of the night. And you wake up and your mind's going, you can't sleep. And this question came to me. I thought, wow, that's the key question. That proves that John 7:37 cannot be the eighth day. Let's ask this question. Here's the question. Prove John 7:37 cannot be the eighth day. This is the question. If John 7:37 was the eighth day, as we used to believe, and as many of the Church of God still believe, and the day following was a weekly Sabbath, as we're told in John 9:14, then that would be a weekly Sabbath. In that case, not just a high day Sabbath, but a weekly Sabbath, if John 7:37 is the eighth day, because John 9:14 occurs on the next day. Then on what day of the week would the eighth day have occurred on? If John 7:37 was the eighth day, and the next day was a weekly Sabbath, then what day of the week would that eighth day sacred assembly have occurred on? Well, it would mean that it occurred on a Friday. If you have the eighth day being followed by a weekly Sabbath, then that particular eighth day had to be on a Friday. Which means, what in regard to calendars? It means, number one, if that was true, then the eighth day would have fallen on a Friday. That means you'd have to use a Hebrew calendar without postponement rules, because you can never get an eighth day falling on a Friday when you have postponement rules. You can't get it. It's going to be postponed. So it had to be a Hebrew calendar without postponement rules if it fell on a Friday, or some other form of a new moon calendar would have had to been used. So the big question is this. Is there any calendar, Hebrew or new moon, where you can have the Feast of Tabernacles on the eighth day from Friday to Friday, followed by a Wednesday Passover of the next year using the same calendar? And the answer is, from what scholars and experts have put together and figured out and calculated, no, you can't. The Hebrew calendar without postponement rules will not work, given the information we have in the book of John, as we'll see, or any other calendar that has the Feast of Tabernacles from Friday to Friday. No Friday to Friday, eighth day, Feast of Tabernacles on eighth day, will work for any of the years surrounding the time Christ would have had to have died. In other words, there is no calendar that can have the feast from a Friday to Friday, followed by a Passover, falling on a Wednesday, the following year, using the same calendar. Thus, John 7:37 cannot be referring to the eighth day. It just doesn't work. There is no calendar that will work, will compute. John 7:37 can only be referring to the seventh and last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which also then means that John chapters 8, 9, and the beginning part of John 10 has to be talking about events that happened on the eighth day, which is also, then it says, was the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath as well. Now then, looking at a chart I'm going to show you, let's put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, well, I've modified this chart, but this chart actually comes from an appendix to our doctrinal study paper titled Summary of the Hebrew Calendar, which was approved by the Council of Elders back in February of 1997. The Hebrew calendar appendix lists all the possible dates for the holy days from the years 26 AD or 26 CE, as I'll explain that in a moment, all the way up through 34 AD or 34 CE. And when those would have fallen, the three possible calendars that could have been in use. And those three possible calendars would be the Hebrew calendar calculated with postponement rules, the Hebrew calendar calculated without postponement rules, and based on observations of the new moon. And as we'll see, the only calendar that tends to work, given what we have in the book of John, but the only one that does work, is the Hebrew calendar with postponement rules. It's the only one that will work. So first let's look at alternate Passover. And I've simplified this. I've got it down to just the Passover and the 8th day, because those are the two ones we're interested in. When the Passover occurred and when the 8th day occurred in these various years, by calculation or by observation, by what they have charts for the new moon, from the years 26 through 34 AD or CE, maybe through 33. So we'll look at that. So the next one is alternate Passover and 8th day occurrences by use of different calculations for the years of 26 to 29. And I got CE here. CE means Common Era or Christian Era. We used to use AD, which Anno Domini, which means the year of our Latin for the year of our Lord, and BC was before Christ. That's not used so much commonly anymore. Christ was born in 5 BC. How would he be born before Christ? If they don't use Anno Domini, year of our Lord, or before Christ anymore, then mostly they use CE or BCE, which means either Common Era or before the Common Era, or Christian Era before the Christian Era. So that's what I have up here. I have the term CE up here. And again, I'm just focusing on the Passover and the 8th day to keep it as simple as possible. And these are from the years 26 to 29 CE, and just the Passover and 8th day for these different years, 26, 27, 28, 29. And then the next chart here will show from 30 to 33. But right now, let's go back to 26 through 29. Now, for Passover, I have put all the Wednesday Passovers in bold. Oh, oops, got the wrong head there. Whoops. Get the right one. All the Wednesday Passovers. So here, oh, what happened? Did we lose it back there? Okay, I can go on up. All right. Okay, there we go. Now if I can hit the right button here without doing it. Okay, I put all the Passovers in bold. For 27 CE, the Passover could fall on a Wednesday using the Hebrew calendar with postponements. And also, the Passover could fall on a Wednesday in 28 CE using observation. It falls on Wednesday, April 28th. I've also put all of the 8th day, when the 8th day could occur on a Saturday or a Friday. Why a Friday? Because, of course, it had to fall on a Friday if John 7:37 was the 8th day, as we used to believe. So, for example, look at the 8th day could fall on a Saturday on 27 CE, using the Hebrew calendar with postponements. It would fall on a Friday without postponements in that year. And it could fall on a Saturday in 28 with observation. First then, let's prove that John 7:37 could not be referring to the 8th day just by the calendars here. Because there are no possible calendars with the 8th day falling on a Friday. It couldn't have fallen on a Friday because there are no calendars where the 8th day could fall on a Friday, which is then followed by a Wednesday Passover using that same calendar. Okay, just look here at this for 27 to 29 CE. The only time it falls on a Friday is here. But if you go to the next year, when Passover would have to fall on a Wednesday, for the next year in 28, the Passover falls on a Monday using this calendar. So that can't be right. Now, let's see, do I have any other Fridays up there? No other Fridays up there. Let's go to the next one. The 8th day could fall on a Friday right here using the Hebrew calendar without postponements. But you'd have to have the next year, you have to have the Passover on a Wednesday. And the next year, if you use this calendar here, the next year Passover falls on a Saturday. So that doesn't work. The bottom line is there is no calendar you can use that will work with the Feast of Tabernacles and 8th day on a Friday, or the 8th day falling on a Friday, followed by Wednesday Passover using the same calendar. So it proves that John 7:37 could not be referring to the 8th day. There is no calendar that will work. it has to be referring to the seventh and last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Finally, let's see what possible calendars and years work by what is recorded in the book of John. Now, let's go back here for a second to the first one. By what we have in the book of John, what do we have to look for? We have to find a calendar and years. We have a Passover falling on a Wednesday, which is then preceded by the 8th day falling on a Saturday in the previous year using the same calendar. Let's look at all the possibilities of the Passover falling on a Wednesday. So right here, you've got Passover on a Wednesday in 27. But for that calendar to have worked, in the previous year, in 26, that 8th day would have had to fall on a Saturday. It doesn't, it falls on a Monday. So that calendar doesn't work. You have the Passover falling on a Wednesday in 28 using observation of the new moon. But if you use the observation of the new moon for the previous year, when the feast would have to fall on a Saturday, it falls on a Sunday. That doesn't seem to work. Now, over here, take note of when the 8th day occurs in 29 of the Common Era, or 29 AD, using the Hebrew calendar with and without postponement rules. The 8th day in 29, if you use the Hebrew calendar with postponements, it will fall on a Tuesday. Without postponements, it falls on a Monday. Okay. However, the common thought is that Christ must have died in 30 AD because the Passover, as we'll see, in 30 AD, the next year, will fall on a Wednesday using the Hebrew calendar with or without postponements. The problem, however, you have to find a calendar where the previous year, the feast goes from Saturday to Saturday. And if you go to the next year where you have the Passover here, on a Wednesday with or without postponements in the year 30, but you go back to the previous year, you have the 8th day falling on a Tuesday or a Monday. That doesn't work. So that calendar doesn't work. So by using those Hebrew calendars, when did the 8th day, again, that doesn't work. I already went through that. Which indicates Christ probably did not die on the Passover 30 AD, because in the previous year, the Feast of Tabernacles could not have gone from Saturday to Saturday. It'd be a Monday or Tuesday or whatever it had there. Tuesday or Monday, both these cases. Which indicates Christ probably did not die on the Passover 30 CE or 30 AD, as many believe and advocate. Now let's go to this calendar here. First note 33 CE. In 33 CE, you can have the Passover on a Wednesday without postponements. However, the previous 8th day assembly, if you use this calendar here, if you go as far ahead as 33, it's interesting that the world thinks that Christ died on a Friday, and 33 that can't happen because Passover can't fall on a Friday. Well, it can this way here, I guess. But the trouble is, the feast wouldn't come out right. But this way, 33 CE, if you have Passover, could fall on a Wednesday, but if you use that same Hebrew calendar without postponements, in the previous year, you'd have the 8th day falling on a Tuesday. So that doesn't work. Now in 31 CE, you have the Passover falling on a Wednesday if you use the Hebrew calendar with postponements. And when does the 8th day occur in the previous year using the same calendar? Here you have the previous year in 30, the 8th day would have occurred on a Saturday. This here is the only scenario that fits what we have in the book of John. Christ dying on a Wednesday in 31, preceded by the 8th day falling on a Saturday in 30, and the year before that. And the only calendar that works with that scenario, what we have in the book of John, is the Hebrew calendar with postponement rules. Observation doesn't work. I just want to point out, observation you have in 31, you have the Passover falling on a Wednesday also, but if you use observation and you go to the previous year, you have the 8th day coming out on a Monday. So observation, by what the experts have put together about when the new moon would have been observed, that doesn't work either. The only one that works is this one right here. Wednesday, dying on a Wednesday at 31 CE, and the previous Feast of Tabernacles falling on Saturday in 30 CE. So that is the bottom line. Then let's go to the bottom line summary. John 9:14, it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. as we know, it was also the 8th day Sacred Assembly. 30 CE, using the Common Era, or 30 AD, using the Hebrew calendar with postponements, the 8th day fell on a Saturday, October 7th, just as John 9:14 indicates. Daniel 9:27, but in the middle of the week, he, Christ, shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, of course, by his own sacrifice. And in 31 CE, or AD, using the Hebrew calendar with postponements, the Passover fell on Wednesday, April 25th. So in conclusion, when we fit all the pieces together, it would appear that Christ died on the Passover of 31 CE, or AD, as has been the position of the Church of God for many, many years. It would also appear, contrary to the opinion of many, that the only calendar that could work is the Hebrew calendar with postponements. I know many are not going to agree with that conclusion, and there is some difficulties with it. There's no doubt there are difficulties, because you have to go back and show that the Hebrew calendar with postponements was being used at the time of Christ. Is that possible? Can you show that? Can you prove it? You can't prove it, but you can demonstrate it's a possibility. And this is a very strong indicator to me it's a possibility. But what I'm trying to demonstrate is simply to defend the Hebrew calendar we're now using, show it is a very viable calendar, and going all the way back to the time of Christ and actually a long time before that. I will touch on some of the opposing views and difficulties in the next Bible study, to be fair and balanced, if you will. But for me, the evidence of putting all the pieces of the puzzle together heavily weigh in favor of the Hebrew calendar that we're now using with postponement rules, because that does fit. Well, then you go back and calculate with what we have in the book of John. Now, just to quickly lead into the next Bible study, the Hebrew calendar was calculated from what is called the Molad of Tishri, or the new moon of Tishri, or the new moon of the 7th month, or the Day of Trumpets. It's calculated from that particular point, from the Day of Trumpets, which is very interesting in and of itself, why it's done that way. But next time in part 10, I will kind of cover trumpets as the reference point for the Hebrew calendar, and go into possible origins of the Hebrew calendar, and actually trace back how there was a Hebrew calendar, or a calendar very similar to the Hebrew calendar, used all the way back to the time of the ancient Sumerians. And there's proof of that. The Hebrew calendar is a 19-month time cycle calendar with 7 years added with the added 13th month. That calendar very similar to that, or with that, incorporated those things, was used all the way back to the ancient Sumerians, as people now researching can demonstrate and prove. So we'll end here for now. But again, it's a very interesting subject, and again, I'm just trying to show that the calendar we're using can be, a lot of credence can be given to that calendar that we're now using, even going back all the way to the time of Christ and before.